Hello spooky people, thank you so much for joining me back on the channel. So today I wanted to share with you my top 10 spooky shows that I watched growing up. And I wanted to share this list because these shows were all instrumental in developing my love of horror and the macabre. So anybody that grew up in the 80s and 90s will probably know these shows as well, and we will take a little walk down through memory lane and talk about these shows together. Before we get into the list, please make sure to hit the subscribe button below so you don't miss any of my spooky uploads. So at number 10 we have Ari Indiana, which came out in 1991, and here we follow Marshall Teller, who moves to a new town called Erie, and he realizes that things just aren't really quite normal with his new town. So along with his friends, they go on adventures to discover the weird and otherworldly. So this show really reminds me of R.L. Stine's Haunting Hour, which is also like an anthology sort of series that came out a lot later, but I can definitely see the parallels here, and this was definitely one of my favorites growing up. In particular, I can remember one of the Halloween episodes where Marshall and his friend Simon are babysitting Marshall's younger brother, and while they're watching a movie, Marshall's brother actually switches places with one of the mummies in the movie. So of course all sorts of shenanigans ensue, and they try to get Marshall's little brother back and the mummy back in the movie. So again, this one is more of an anthology series. It's not really a continuing story. It's definitely one that has shaped my love of all things weird and macabre. At number 9 we have Tales from the Crypt from 1989, and this one I think everybody grew up with, and I actually managed to find season 1 of Tales from the Crypt on DVD at Walmart a couple of weeks ago, so I haven't started watching it yet, but I'm sure that's going to take me right back to when I was growing up. And again, this is another anthology series, but what really does it for me is the Crypt Keeper, of course, which I think is everybody's favorite, and his just unbelievably cheesy sense of humor and the puns and everything that happen in between the actual stories. So this one is definitely a favorite of mine, and I'm gonna enjoy getting back into this one in the next couple of weeks. At number 8 is the Odyssey, which is a Canadian show that came out in 1992. This one is actually not horror or macabre, it is more fantasy. So here a young 11-year-old boy named Jay has an accident and he lands in a coma. So we have kind of a split here between what's going on in the real world and what's going on in Jay's head while he's in the coma. So basically while he's in a coma, he and his two best friends enter into a fantastical world called Downworld, where they fight pirates and generals, and there's a war going on, and they're trying to get Jay back to the real world. So this one again is not horror, but it is just kind of weird, and I love fantasy almost as much as I love horror, especially when it's done really well. So this is the first on my list that if you're a Canadian kid from the 80s or 90s, you will probably remember this one. The next on my list again is another Canadian show called Der kleine Vampire, or The Little Vampire, which is based on German children's books that follow Anton, who is a young human boy who befriends Rudiger, who is a young vampire. And Anton and Rudiger go on adventures along with Rudiger's family, and they're trying to keep his actual identity hidden from Anton's family and the people that live in his apartment building. So this show is wonderfully cheesy. I actually found some episodes here on YouTube, and I absolutely loved it as a kid, and I gotta say it hasn't aged well, but the story still stands. And I only found out recently that these were based on actual books, so I would like to get the books of Der kleine Vampire written in English so I can add to my vintage horror collection. So next on the list is the hilarious House of Frankenstein from 1971, and this one is really silly and really cheesy. You have people dressed up as Dracula and Frankenstein and Igor and all sorts of other monsters who are, I believe, in Dracula's castle in Transylvania, but he also has a scientific lab there, and they get into all sorts of shenanigans. But I think what really does it for me with this show is it is narrated by none other than Vincent Price. So again, here if you're a Canadian kid that grew up in the 70s and 80s, you'll probably remember this one. Number 5 5 is actually a non-fictional show. It is Unsolved Mysteries, which came out in 1987. And my husband and I have been enjoying watching the older episodes on Amazon Prime recently. And I remember it back when it was the Robert Stack episodes. Of course, it was taken over by a different host in later episodes, but I remember when I was super young when the show first came out, and I think this was pretty much the same way for everyone, that the introductory music for this show is just spooky, and it definitely creeped me out when I was really young. But once I got into actually watching it, this was one of the quintessential shows that shaped my love not only for the supernatural, but for true crime as well. This was the first show that I had watched that had dealt with true crime and missing persons, and that has carried on through a lifetime. So Unsolved Mysteries is definitely high up on my list. So number 4 is In Search Of, which came out in the 1970s and was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. So this is another non-fictional show that discussed everything that had to do with the supernatural, from ghosts and poltergeists, witchcraft, UFOs, alien abductions, and the like. And I have to say that this show was the one that really shaped my love of everything supernatural and ghost hunting and all of that sort of thing. And of course, I grew up in a haunted house myself, so this show really fit in with the entire ambiance of the old Victorian, and I found it quite instructional. So I think this show, more so than anything else, really kickstarted my love of everything supernatural. Number 3, of course, is Goosebumps from 1995, and this is going to be a popular one for pretty much anyone. So of course, this was a TV series that was created off of R.L. Stine's Goosebumps series, and really brings to life everything that was going on in our imaginations as we were reading the books. So again, with this one, I have been enjoying rewatching some of the old episodes. They are absolutely cheesy and they didn't age well, but I think the stories themselves are so nostalgic that it just brings me right back to when I was a kid. Number 2 on the list is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and this one is probably the biggest cult classic on this list. I was really fighting for if I was going to put this one at number 2 or number 1, but it ultimately landed at the number 2 spot. So I had watched the movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer back in 1992 or 93 when it came out, and that was of course the movie with Christy Swanson and Luke Perry, which was the original of the story. And I remember when I heard that Joss Whedon was going to develop it into a series, and I was old enough to kind of wonder to myself, are they really going to do it justice, or is it going to be as good as the movie? And of course, it certainly lived up to all of the hype, and it's just a wonderful show. I think 2 of the biggest reasons why I love this so much is not only does it deal with the supernatural, but it also deals with real life problems, of course, and this came out when I was a teenager, so it was all really relevant to me. And the other thing, of course, is that Buffy Summers is the quintessential horror heroine, and she's badass, and she's a feminist, and she's just wonderful. And funny enough, even though Buffy is my absolute favorite show of all time, I actually never got into watching Angel. Angel was not one of my favorite characters on the original show, so I didn't get into watching the spin-off, but I do have the first 2 seasons of Angel downstairs, so I think I might give him a try. Apparently he got a little bit better once he got his own show, so we'll see about that. And before we go on with number 1, I do have an honorable mention here, and this came out much later. This wasn't a show that I grew up with, but I did want to mention it on here because this one, like In Search Of, this is probably one of my favorite non-fiction TV shows, and that is the first 6 seasons of A Haunting. And this show came out in the early 2000s, and it kind of was one of those ones that kickstarted all of the ghost hunting shows where they go in and they have the shaky cameras and they're asking things to knock on the wall or stuff like that. And I have to say, I'm not into those types of ghost hunting shows, but this one interviews the families who have experienced hauntings and possessions and the like, and do reenactments. And for the first 6 seasons at least of this show, there was none of the silliness of the ghost hunters going in and stirring everything up. But this is another show show that I found very instructional and is something we rewatch over and over almost every single year, so I wanted to mention it here as well. And in the #1 spot of the spooky shows that I grew up with is Are You Afraid of the Dark? And I am talking about the 1990s version, not the new one. So here again, if you're a Canadian kid, you probably definitely grew up with this show. It was hugely popular when I was growing up, and here we follow a group of teenagers known as the Midnight Society who meet up in the woods and tell ghost stories. And this was so ingrained in Canadian culture during the 90s that even we would pretend that we were members of the Midnight Society and tell ghost stories all night. So this was also an anthology series. Like I said, each episode kind of follows a new story from beginning to end, which is really great. You don't have to invest yourself into an entire series, but kind of piggybacking off here, every year during Halloween, this show would come out with a new season. I believe there was 5 seasons, I can't quite remember. But when a new season would start on YTV, they would have YTV's Dark Night, which happened every Halloween. And I remember I was so in love with this TV special that I would rush home and forego hitting up more houses for candy so I could watch YTV's Dark Night. So besides having new episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark, it also had shows on that night like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Goosebumps, and so on and so on. And in between the episodes of the shows, you would have the YTV PJs, which stands for Program Jockeys, I believe, and they would talk about all sorts of spooky stuff, and they would have trivia and contests and all of that sort of thing. So #1 is Are You Afraid of the Dark? And piggybacking off that is YTV's Dark Night. It's probably one of my favorite memories from when I was growing up. But if you are a Canadian kid and you remember YTV's Dark Night, let me know down in the comments below. I'd be really interested to know if anybody else remembers this. So there you have it. There's my top 10 spooky scary shows that I grew up with that shaped my love of everything spooky and the macabre. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please make sure to hit the like button and comment below if you enjoyed this video. It really helps out the channel. Until next time, stay spooky guys. Bye!